Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Very warm welcome to the 8th session of ILEM Istanbul Talks series. My name is Ömer Faruk Yeni. I'm an independent researcher and moderator of today's talk. So it's my pleasure to welcome our guest, Professor Marion Katz from New York University. I'll give you a brief introduction to those who might not know her. She received her PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. She has published 4 books, most of them in the field of Islamic law, gender, and ritual. Her first book, Body of Text, examines the emergence and crystallization of the law of ritual purity using early sources to reconstruct the formative debates among Muslim scholars. The second book, which we are going to be today, is The Birth of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, looks at the religious goals and assumptions driving of the rituals commemorating the Prophet's birth. The third book, Prayer in Islamic Thought and Practice, is a survey of the rules and the practices associated with the 5 daily prayers. And her most recent book, Woman in the Mosque, A History of Legal Thought and Social Practice, examines the evolution of the law, presence and activities in the mosque. Her upcoming book, hopefully, looks at the ethics surrounding marriage and domestic labor and other related issues. Our talk is live now on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, where you can leave your comments and questions during the event that I can bring it to our speaker. So title of the talk today is What Can Maolids, in the sense of ceremonies commemorating of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the genre of texts produced for performance in such ceremonies contribute to the study of Islam. So our schedule is going 45-minute talk and 50 Q&A session to be followed. So thank you for dear professor, and it's your word now.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's a real honor. Could you share my PowerPoint? Thank you. So, studying Maolids is not a choice that emerged naturally from my training in Islamic studies in the United States. Rather, it was inspired by my complete inability to make sense of something I encountered on the last day of a visit to Damascus in 1998. It happened to be the month of Rabi al-Awwal, and I noticed that pamphlets with devotional texts about the birth of the Prophet Muhammad were being sold on the street. One of the pamphlets I purchased contained Mawlid al-Arus, pictured here, a work traditionally attributed to the 12th century Hanbali preacher Ibn al-Jawzi. Nothing about the contents of this text made sense to me on the basis of my Islamic studies training, which had focused centrally on formal Islamic disciplines, such as fiqh, hadith, and kalam. Perhaps I would have been less disoriented by this text had I had more background in Sufism, but there is also nothing specifically Sufi about it. As a formal text in classical Arabic, it also did not fit my preconceptions of quote-unquote folk Islam. A decade later, I published a book about the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad and the genre of texts that commemorated. By that time, my understanding of Mawlid al-Arus had changed enormously. More than simply helping me to understand Maolids as a specific phenomenon, though, this decade of study produced some thoughts about the study of pre-modern Islam in general that I would like to share with you today. To study Maolids is to dive into a sea of texts. Some of them are well-known, published, and attributed to famous authors. Some of them are well-known and widely published, but still of unknown origin. Many of them are forgotten manuscripts by unknown authors. Indeed, if you look for manuscripts of Mawlids in major and minor collections around the world, you will find literally hundreds of them. In my years studying Mawlids, I encountered everything from an elaborately calligraphed and illuminated manuscript held at the Süleymaniye to a Mawlid written in ballpoint pen on lined paper by a young professional Mawlid reciter in Yemen. And yet, in proportion to the sheer volume of Mawlid texts, they are very little studied. As a number of people pointed out to me when I embarked on this project, this is in part because many of them are not very good, in the sense that as individual texts, they are often unexciting and unoriginal, and also in the sense that they're sometimes sloppy in grammar or penmanship, although they run the gamut in this regard. Their significance is signaled not by their individual quality as measured in intellectual or aesthetic terms, but by the sheer volume in which they have survived. If there's one thing the written record can tell us about Mawlids, it's that many people over the years have cared about them a lot. I was initially unsure what to do with these works because I was used to studying texts that are important in the sense that their content is inherently sophisticated, original, or influential. What to do with texts that were repetitive, formulaic, and often obscure, and in many cases impossible to securely date or to attribute to a specific author. After some struggle, I realized that these texts had a lot to say about a number of issues of serious interest to people who study Islam. But because they were framed as scripts for practice rather than as overt arguments, one had to be very attentive to the recurring patterns and identify their central themes. There is, of course, also a large polemical literature about the legal permissibility of the Mawlid ceremony and associated practices, such as the Qiyam, standing up in honor of the mention of the Prophet's birth. A very good English language book by the Dutch scholar N.J.G. Kaptein covers the history of those debates. However, I came to realize that the question of whether the Mawlid is a bid'ah or an innovation is quite different from the question of why people celebrated the Mawlid in the first place. The central questions I came to pose were, number one, what did people who held or attended Mawlids hope to achieve? And number two, what were the underlying assumptions about the world and the way it works that underlay these practices associated with the Mawlid? This is how I ended up with a chapter in my book on gifts and reciprocity, a chapter on emotion and law, and a chapter on time and merit. So at first glance, Mawlid ceremonies can seem like a rather loose collection of pleasant practices without a clear basis in the revealed sources. Recitation of the story of the Prophet's birth, Quranic recitation, blessings of the Prophet, Salat ala Nabi, and often the serving of food or the sprinkling of guests with rosewater. On closer examination, though, these practices reveal a deeper logic that is supported by discussions of the Mawlid in the normative literature. In the Mawlid literature, the Prophet Muhammad himself is often envisioned as a gift from God. Indeed, the supreme gift that demands appropriate reciprocation. The entire Mawlid celebration can be understood as a counter gift, a gift in return. And this is why discussions of the Mawlid often talk about it in terms of the expenditure of money. Jalaluddin as-Suyuti compares the celebration of the Mawlid with the Prophet's performance of the Aqiqah sacrifice on his own behalf. Suyuti reasons that since the Prophet's grandfather had already done an Aqiqah when the Prophet was an infant, the only reasonable explanation for the Prophet's repetition of the sacrifice was that he did so, quote, in order to express thanks for God's creation of him as a mercy to the worlds and as an honor to his community. Thus, it is desirable for us as well to express thanks for his birth by the gathering of brethren, the serving of food, and similar forms of pious activity and expressions of delight. To hold a Mawlid is to give back. It's an instance of the ethical and religious obligation of shukr and ni'mah, giving thanks for benefactions. However, It's not just the material resources spent on the Mawlid celebration that can be understood as reciprocating God's gift of the Prophet. Rather, the blessings and recitations performed at the Mawlid are themselves understood as offerings. This is because they are understood to generate religious merit, thawab. The most prominent thawab-generating activity involved in Mawlids is the invocation of blessings on the Prophet, or Salat ala Nabi. From the earliest examples available to us, Mawlid texts feature blessings of the Prophet and also emphasize the copious rewards of blessing the Prophet. However, thawab does not merely benefit the Mawlid participants themselves. Rather, thawab can be donated to others. It is a medium of exchange. Although it's very difficult to date the du'a texts that traditionally close the Mawlid ceremony, such prayers routinely involve the donation of the merit generated by the ceremony to a long list of recipients, often including the parents of the participants, the host of the Mawlid, and even the Prophet himself. The more scholarly Mawlid texts sometimes include explicit discussions of the possibility and parameters of such transfers of merit. It was particularly debated whether it was possible or appropriate to donate merit to the Prophet. On the one hand, some deemed this unnecessary or even insulting, given the Prophet's exalted status. On the other hand, donation of merit to the Prophet was an appealing means of establishing a devotional relationship with him, a relationship that the worshipper hoped would lead to his intercession on the Day of Judgment. Mawlids also involved gifts and reciprocity among the human beings involved in the ceremony. Mawlid hosts offered hospitality and often food to attendees. Participants helped to generate merit, honored him or helped the host to generate merit, honored him or her by attending, and often contributed a present to the cost of the Mawlid. This aspect of gifting was important enough that scholars who criticized Mawlids sometimes focused on the possibility that guests felt pressured to contribute money. The 14th century Maliki scholar Ibn al-Hajj, for instance, complained that hosting a Mawlid could be a way of getting back the gifts one had bestowed on one's friends and neighbors on other festive occasions, such as weddings. The holding of Mawlids thus seems to have played a role in the economy of gifts that cemented relationships and defined social networks in contemporary Cairo. Another major theme that emerged from the Mawlid texts was the central role of religiously appropriate emotions. Perhaps the most central to the justification of Mawlid celebrations was the role of joy, farah. On the one hand, rejoicing was understood as the proper response to God's favors, including the bestowal of the Prophet on the world. Joy was another manifestation of shukr and ni'mah, the ethical and legal obligation to give thanks for benefits received. Mawlid texts also feature other arguments in favor of the salvific role of joy. The most widespread is a story that appears already in Ad-Durr al-Munazzam fil Mawlid al-Mu'azzam of Abu Abbas al-Azafi, perhaps the earliest preserved Mawlid text. Al-Azafi recounts, "It is transmitted from Al-Abbas that he said, 'I had a fraternal and sincere relationship with Abu Jahl, may God curse him. When he died and God stated what he did about him, I grieved for him and was concerned about him. For an entire year, I asked God to let me see him, that is, in a dream. Finally, I saw him burning in a blaze. I asked him about his condition, and he said, I have gone to hell and am in painful and constant torment, which is not alleviated for me and which does not go away, except on Monday nights. Then the torment is removed from me. I said, why and how is that? He said to me, when Muhammad was born on that night, a maidservant of mine came and gave me the good tidings that his mother had given birth to him. I rejoiced at his birth and freed a slave girl of mine because of my joy in him. God rewarded me for that, to the point that he removed my torment every Monday night because of it. This basic story appears in Al-Bukhari, although only as an explanatory comment transmitted without a full isnad. However, al-Bukhari's report does not either state that Abu Lahab freed the slave specifically on the occasion of the Prophet's birth, or relate his reward specifically to his rejoicing. The story's role in the Mawlid genre was sealed by Ibn al-Jazari, who recounts the anecdote and comments, "If Abu Lahab, the unbeliever whose condemnation was revealed in the Quran, was rewarded in hell for his joy at the night of the Prophet's birth, what is the case of a Muslim monotheist of the community of Muhammad the Prophet, who delights in his birth and spends all that he can afford for love of him? By my life, his reward from the beneficent God can only be that he graciously causes him to enter the gardens of bliss." In addition to joy, the emotion most frequently invoked by Mawlid proponents is love. After condemning the falsehoods of popular storytellers who preach about the Mawlid, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami suggests an appropriate form of celebration, quote, "for those who intend to do good and manifest joy and delight in the Prophet and love for him." Unlike rejoicing in the Prophet, love for him is universally recognized to be an obligation of Muslim believers. As is well known, even Ibn Taymiyyah, who generally regarded the Mawlid celebration as a bad bid'ah, conceded that a person who celebrated out of love for the Prophet might be rewarded by God for this love. Mawlid texts not only expressed love for the Prophet, but were understood to evoke love for him by describing the wonders of his life and personality. Mawlids can thus be understood as part of a project to form the emotional dispositions of a pious Muslim self. The themes that are most central to the Mawlid texts, such as religious merit and pious emotion, often fall into the cracks of the formal Islamic disciplines. There is no single disciplinary home or literary genre where one can locate themes such as merit or emotion. Nevertheless, such issues are as pervasive as they are elusive. Reading Mawlids and discussions of Mawlids underline to me the importance of understanding a basic concept such as thawab. It was striking to me that the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam, a very reputable reference work for the Western study of Islam, has no entry on thawab. There is only a 24-word glossary entry stating that it refers to recompense in the next world. On the one hand, this could be a function of the framework of the Encyclopedia of Islam, which approaches Islam more as a civilization than as a religious tradition. On the other hand, however, the concept of thawab is elusive in the classical Islamic literature as well. It is certainly relevant to both kalam and fiqh, but in neither genre does one usually find in-depth explanations of what it actually is and how it works. This absence may have led me to overemphasize the rare texts that do directly address it, such as Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya's Kitab al-Ruh, which may not reflect the most common understandings of the concept. Indeed, in the English language Islamic studies literature, the scholars who have illuminated concepts such as barakah and thawab in greatest depth are anthropologists who deal with the everyday practices of living Muslims rather than with Islamic texts. One reason that Mawlid texts don't fit neatly into Islamic scholarly categories is that their production was not monopolized by the ulama. But what can we know about the personnel and processes involved in producing the best-known Mawlids? One issue that perplexed me as I began to work with Mawlid texts was exactly what kind of texts these actually were. On the one hand, some Mawlids display a consistent literary structure and style that suggests that they were composed as a unit by an individual author, often one of considerable sophistication. In some cases, for instance, they are composed in verse throughout. In other cases, however, a Mawlid is a composite drawn from a repertory of conventional components. A Mawlid usually opens with an elaborate introductory passage known as a dibaje in flowery round prose, which is its most distinctive and stable feature and often lends it its name. The body of the Mawlid usually alternates passages of rhymed prose, recounting the life and birth of the Prophet, with interludes of devotional poetry, each of which is punctuated with the invocation of prayers upon the Prophet. The Mawlid text most widely represented in the manuscript collections I've consulted is Mawlid al-Arus, the work that first inspired my project, which begins with a dibaja that starts, "Praise be to God, who brought forth from the blaze on the forehead of the bride of the presence a luminous dawn, and made rise in the orbits of perfection from the constellations of beauty a radiant sun and moon, and chose the master of the two worlds as a beloved, a noble one, and an emissary in pre-eternity." So you can see that's very distinctive, right? Very similar in style and content is the Mawlid known as Sharaf al-Anam, pictured here, which also remains in wide circulation, often in the form of cheap pamphlets. It's significant that neither of these texts has a firmly identified author. Mawlid al-Arus is implausibly attributed to Ibn al-Jawzi, while Sharaf al-Anam usually lacks any attribution at all. The authorship of Sharaf al-Anam was a subject of speculation as early as the 16th century, when the Yemeni scholar Ibn Adayba claimed to have discovered that it was drawn from a book of Mawa'idh and Raqa'iq by an otherwise unknown Andalusian author. In other words, it appears that its origins, or at least the origins of the rhymed prose introduction that is its defining feature, may have been in a source book for preaching and exhortation. It's also notable that neither Mawlid al-Arus nor Sharaf al-Anam has the kind of full rhymed title that an authored text of this period would usually originally have had. In each case, the prevalent title is simply a word or phrase drawn from its opening line. After the opening passage of rhymed prose, there's some degree of variation in the components included in the body of each of these Mawlids. Texts such as Mawlid al-Arus and Sharaf al-Anam straddle the boundary between authored compositions and the anonymous products of a shared tradition. As one can see in the manuscript record, their components have been reused and recombined for centuries. In general, Mawlids are texts intended for use. Their performance-oriented nature meant that several different constituencies or groups of people were involved in producing them. One example of the possible dynamics involved is provided by an anecdote from the 17th century Syrian Sufi and Adib Abdul-Ghani an-Nablusi. He writes that in late Safar of the year 1105 Hijri, 1693 of the Western calendar, that is, soon before the arrival of the Prophet's birthday, he was visited by one Sheikh Mansour, the head of the Mawlid reciters in Nablus. In addition to commissioning some devotional poetry from an-Nablusi, Sheikh Mansour asked Abdul-Ghani to write him a dibaja for the Prophet's Mawlid. Abdul-Ghani presents the full text of the elaborate rhymed prose introduction he composed on that occasion, finishing by saying, etc., continuing with the rest of what they present of the story of the Prophet's birthday, as is customary. In other words, in this anecdote, a professional Mawlid reciter approaches a religious scholar, who is also an accomplished litterateur, to request a piece of artful rhymed prose to open the Mawlid. The content of the rest of the Mawlid, however, is determined by custom rather than being formally composed by the scholar. Abdul-Ghani takes this anecdote as an occasion to remark on two other dibajas that he has composed at the request of another Mawlid reciter in Damascus. Each of the two, he says, was a feat of literary art. One of them incorporated the names of different Quranic chapters, and the other incorporated the titles of works from different scholarly disciplines. In this case, Abdul-Ghani is not able to present the full texts because the unnamed reciter chose to keep them to himself. Abdul-Ghani remarks of the first dibaja that, quote, he recites it to the people at the time of the noble Mawlid, and they are astonished by the beauty of its expressions. He does not share it with anyone else, and it is unique to him in Damascus among all the people. This example suggests a dynamic that includes Mawlid audiences as well as performers. Presumably, this reciter monopolizes the clever openings penned for him by Abdul Ghani because they increase the demand for his performances. All this is not to deny the pious motives driving Mawlid composition, which are palpable in the case of Abdul Ghani Andalusi. However, it does suggest that Mawlids were not just a top-down doctrinal matter, but reflected the sensibilities and needs of scholars, of grassroots ritual professionals, and of lay people with religious and literary tastes of their own. This anecdote, of course, represents the specific conditions of one time and place. However, the manuscript record suggests that a stable and authored dibaja, although one whose specific author might be lost to time, often opens a Mawlid drawn from a well of customary components. It is easy to imagine that the body of the Mawlid could be assembled by a professional reciter who was not necessarily a scholar. Some of these texts would have been written down only to be worn out by use or discarded after memorization. When I studied Mawlids with female professional Mawlid reciters in Yemen in 2001, most of them could not even find their original written Mawlid notebooks. They had become unnecessary once the material was memorized. The Mawlid manuscripts preserved in the libraries of the world and in the private collections of many families are just the tip of the iceberg of the Mawlids that have existed over the centuries as a tradition of performance. Indeed, I think it is useful to think of many of the well-known Mawlids that we have from prominent religious scholars as responses to a more popular Mawlid tradition that has been shaped over the centuries by audiences and practitioners. This view is supported by the way in which many of the more scholarly Mawlids explicitly or implicitly critique the more popular devotional narratives about the Prophet's birth. For instance, a Mawlid narrative traditionally begins with an account of the primordial light of Muhammad traveling through the generations of the Prophet's forefathers. The Mawlid of Ibrahim ibn Umar al-Ja'bari opens, "Praise be to God who originated the creation of human beings from clay, then breathed into it his spirit, and made the closest of the angels prostrate themselves before him. Then he made his progeny from an extract of base water and deposited his sperm in a secure resting place. Then he changed it into a clot of blood, then into a clump, then into bones which he covered with flesh in the best of forms. Blessed be God, the best of creators." Given the centrality of the theme of the pre-existence of the Prophet in the Mawlid tradition as a whole, al-Ja'bari's detailed evocation of the Quranic account of human creation appears as an obvious, if tacit, rebuke to those who circulated more popular narratives. In a somewhat similar vein, Ibn Kathir opens his Mawlid work by writing, "Praise be to God, who illuminated the world with the appearance of the Master of Messengers and dispelled the shadows of falsity with the light of manifest truth when people had been passing in ways of ignorance." In Ibn Kathir's Mawlid, the light of the Prophet is not the primordial substance from which the cosmos was brought forth, but the light of guidance and truth. Again, I believe that we have to understand this scholarly Mawlid as being in conversation with the broader Mawlid tradition centering on the primordial light of Muhammad, a lot of which I think was probably oral texts that we don't necessarily have access to. Nevertheless, it's important not to think in terms of a simple dichotomy between folk or popular and scholarly or official Islam. As many scholars have observed, there is a continuum between the beliefs and practices of ordinary people and of the ulama. Although it's difficult to know exactly who heard or performed the texts that we have, there's good reason to imagine a significant overlap between learned and unlearned practices. Both in the present and in the past, there's a tendency in some circles to dismiss or to romanticize Mawlids as the religion of old women or of the simple folk. However, I would not take such claims at face value. An example of the complexity of such claims is a fatwa by the 19th century Yemeni reformer Muhammad al-Shawkani. The fatwa is elicited by an inquiry stating that the celebration of the Mawlid has been introduced by the foolish and common people, including the associates of one specific professional chanter, or nashed. The questioner uses several other terms implying the lowly status of Mawlid audiences: the common people, the simple, the rabble, the riffraff. In addition, he mentions the participation of women twice. In his response, Shawkani uses a narrower and more consistent terminology. He refers 4 different times to the common people, al-amma, a category he contrasts with the notables, the a'yan. The terminology used by Shawkani and his anonymous questioner suggests that they both sought to establish a connection between the celebration of the Mawlid and a non-elite or non-scholarly social milieu. For both writers, this linkage serves to undermine the legitimacy of the practice. And to a certain extent, that's probably true. There's no reason to doubt that market folk, women, or non-scholars enthusiastically celebrated the Prophet's birthday. Nevertheless, the 2 men simultaneously reveal that these correlations among socioeconomic milieu, learned stature, and participation in the Mawlid are more an ideal construct than a simple matter of fact. The questioner laments the attendance of notables, a'yan, of the political and religious establishments at a Mawlid, while, as Shawkani notes, the participation of, quote, those who are famed for knowledge, nobility, and leadership, some of the elite who have achieved distinction in seeking knowledge, and the notables. So on the one hand, Shawkani and his questioner are trying to communicate that Mawlids are a kind of ritual that is pursued by, sort of common, ignorant people. But at the same time, they're both signaling that the elites and the scholars actually also participate. So I would say that the Mawlid occurs at the intersection of multiple groups, including scholars and non-scholars, elite and non-elite, men and women. I'd like to finish this talk by examining the ways in which Mawlid celebrations functioned in a specific time and place. Damascus in the late 15th century of the Khomeini era, which would be the 9th century of the Hijra. A uniquely direct insight into the Sitzim Leben, the sort of place in life of Mawlids, is provided by the Diary of Ahmed ibn Tawq, a modestly learned Damascene notary who recorded his daily activities for 2 decades starting in 1480. Over the 20-year period covered by the surviving pages of his diary, Ibn Tawq mentions 41 Mawlid ceremonies. One may assume that this is probably not an exhaustive list, but probably reflects his own fluctuating interest in attending or recording the celebrations. One question we may ask is when and why Damascenes of this period held Mawlid ceremonies. Of the 41 Mawlids mentioned by Ibn Tawq, 18 were held in the month of the Prophet's birthday, and the other 23 were held at other times of the year. Of the 23 Mawlids that did not occur in the month of the Prophet's birth, 9 are explicitly stated to have been performed in observance of special occasions in the lives of the hosting families: 4 weddings, 2 aqiqas, 1 engagement, 1 funeral, and 1 gala arrival in town by the ruler's wife. This distribution suggests that the Mawlid was an appropriate component of life cycle celebrations. The performance of Mawlids in conjunction with life cycle celebrations is also recorded by other sources for Damascus in this period. The historian Ibn Tulun refers to a Mawlid that was recited at the conclusion of a contract of marriage, another at the joint wedding of 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and a third held by the governor of Damascus in honor of the circumcision of 2 of his sons. Why was the Mawlid ceremony so well fitted to transition points in the life of the household, breaking free from its calendrical association with the month of the Prophet's birth? One explanation is that the Mawlid was a form of pious hospitality. In a very basic sense, many Mawlids were parties, or more technically, feasts, walima. Based on Ibn Tawq's appreciative list of the dishes served at one Mawlid, including couscous with chicken and meat, sweet rice with sugar and almond oil, and pastries, the meal could be quite substantial. To host a festive meal was not merely a convivial gesture, but a religiously meritorious act that was strongly recommended for important moments in the life of a family. The historian Ibn Tulun produced a work discussing the various occasions on which it was religiously commendable to hold a walima, a feast. These included a wedding, a new mother's recovery from childbirth, an aqiqah sacrifice, the circumcision of a boy, a child's memorization of the Quran, an engagement, the building of a house, the safe return of a traveler, or even a death. Of course, this list of banqueting opportunities bears a strong resemblance to the list of occasions for Maolids that emerges from Ibn Telks' diary and other contemporary sources. It would appear from the evidence available in the diary that not all Maolids were banquets, but those held for major life cycle events often, and perhaps almost always, were. Ibn Telks' diary also gives some insight into the ways that Maolids fit into networks of gift-giving and reciprocity. He comments that when he attended a Maulid held by one of his neighbors in Rabi' al-Awwal of 1483, 888, he brought as a gift a large gilded candle. Maulid contributions seem to have been similar in magnitude and kind to those associated with wedding celebrations. Ibn Telk records almost identical contributions, in each case a candle and a monetary gift made for a Maulid and for a wedding. So who were the performers and leaders of Maolids in Ibn Telks' Damascus, and what do we know about the contents of the Maolids that he might have heard? Two of the men whose activities as Maulid reciters are most often mentioned by Ibn Telk are Burhanuddin Ibrahim al-Naji and his pupil Barakat ibn al-Kayyal. And Naji's Maulid text, which survives and is now published, it's pictured here, is a lengthy sourcebook of learned discussions of matters associated with the Maulid, from which, he explains, a reciter can select at will for the needs of a specific occasion. It's deeply concerned with issues of religious orthodoxy. For instance, An-Naji dismisses the practice of standing at the mention of the Prophet's birth as an illegitimate ritual innovation, and more generally laments the catastrophic innovations that he says have been introduced into the Maulid ceremony. However, scholars of the strict caste of An-Naji competed in Damascus with reciters who presented themselves more as pious entertainers than as authoritative religious guides. A surviving work by Ibn al-Kayyal, the student of An-Naji, inveighs against the, quote, reciters at gatherings and funerals who chant the Quran with the tunes of sinners, which he defines as melodies borrowed from music, musiqa. Our sources suggest that there were indeed other Maulid reciters in Damascus in this period who were famed precisely for their musical skill and the beauty of their voices. Ibn Tulun notes the performance of a Maulid by one Muhammad al-Ju'aydi, whom he identifies as a muezzin, and who is described in another source as the head of the Maulid reciters in Damascus and a master of the science of melody, ilm al-naghma. Ibn Tulun also describes a head muezzin of the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, who died in 885, 1480, as the possessor of a proverbially lovely voice and as a reciter of Maulids. Although such professional reciters may well have been very pious and may well have been well informed, they were not necessarily religious scholars. I suspect they would have presented Maulids involving the kinds of traditional but more popular stories that were critiqued by Burhanuddin and Naji. Although Ibn Tulun's diary tells us about his everyday life rather than about his religious ideas, we can get some idea of his religious world when it tells us about the texts that he was reading or hearing. For instance, at one place, he mentions having borrowed from a friend a book by Ahmed ibn Yusuf al-Hakari titled Hadiyat al-Ahya ila al-Amwat wa ma yasil ilayhim min athawab ala mamar al-awqat, which means gift to the living, from the living to the dead and the merit that reaches them over time. As we have seen, Maulids can be understood in part as a means of generating religious merit, thawab, to bestow on one's kin, especially deceased parents. In al-Hakari's work, the merit donated by the living to their deceased relatives is imagined in a very vivid and literal way as taking the form of food, clothing, and other gifts enjoyed by the dead in their graves. One passage states, "When you give alms on behalf of your deceased loved one, an angel brings it on a dish of light and calls, 'O estranged denizen of the grave, your relatives have given this to you as a present. Accept it.' The angel puts it into his grave, and the deceased says, 'May God reward my family on my behalf.'" So you see the sort of networks of reciprocity going on here. In contrast, the Maulid text of Burhanuddin an-Naji, which Ibn Telks may very well have heard from the mouth of his author, he notes in his diary going to Maulids that were led by Burhanuddin an-Naji, includes a long and theoretical discussion of whether or not thawab can be transferred to another person, particularly the Prophet. In other words, in Ibn Telks' world, the concept of thawab and the idea of donating thawab was centrally important, but also subject to contestation and debate. Like the religious lives of many or most Muslims historically, Ibn Telks' Islam is neither folk Islam nor learned Islam, but a rich mixture of the two. Before closing, it's worth noting that although written by a man, Ibn Telks' diary also demonstrates that many Maulids were held by women in contemporary Damascus. 6 of the Maulids he mentions in the diary are identified as being hosted by women, which is sort of impressive if you think that a lot of women's Maulids probably were only for women. Other sources also occasionally mention women's Maulids. The contemporary Syrian historian Ibn al-Himsi records that in the month of the Prophet's birthday in 922, the daughter of the governor of Damascus held a Maulid that was attended, quote, by all the ladies of the town, both great and small. Some sense of the role of the Maulid in women's piety in Ibn Telks' time is offered by his Damascene contemporary Aisha al-Ba'uniya, whom most of us know as a Sufi author. She is one of the most famous and prolific pre-modern Muslim authors, and most of her impressive literary output comprised devotional works about the Prophet Muhammad, including a Maulid. Al-Ba'uniya is best known as a Sufi, and certainly the elaborate rhymed prose introduction to her Maulid text, Al-Mawrid al-Ahna fil Mawlid al-Asna, is saturated with mystical terminology. It also prominently invokes her Sufi lineage as well as her biological lineage. According to Hassan Muhammad al-Rababi', who wrote a modern study on her, a manuscript of the Maulid written in her own handwriting closes with a note listing the birth dates of her children. And al-Ba'uniya states that she has added it in order that her children can partake of the barakah of the Prophet's birth. So we cannot know if she ever used her Maulid text in the context of a life cycle celebration. She seems to have entered her children's birth dates retrospectively, not on the occasions of their births. But this note suggests how Maulids could be used to bring blessings and protection to one's family. So to conclude, I believe that Maulids are a rich source for the everyday piety of Muslims in many times and places. Maulids are not merely a naive form of folk religion, but work to create ties of love and reciprocity, binding believers to God, to the Prophet, to the members of their community, and to their own kinsfolk, both live and dead. Even more, they are a valuable source for underappreciated issues such as religious merit and the role of emotion. I thank you for your time and attention.
So thank you so much, dear Professor. It's such an interesting and beautiful occasion to listen and to benefit from your presentation. We have a few questions we received, and I'd like to share with you. So maybe I can give a short brief about the first question. When we talk about the genre Mawlid, which is the birth of Prophet, we are talking about the birth. But in the later period, as we are familiar with those experiences and texts and celebrations in different Muslim countries, that for certain Sufi sense, there is a reality of their death celebrations as Maolids. So this question is about this sort of, if we can consider this as a shift from a birth celebrations to death celebrations. So the question goes, there seems a shift from a birth celebration to a death day celebration after the Prophet. So there are some Sufi sense, like Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, Ahmed al-Badawi, also Ibn Mashish in Morocco. So what might be the reasons for such shift, that since then people are celebrating the death of the saints?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I can't completely answer it. One thing I will say, though, is if you remember, I spoke about the Maulid of Burhanuddin and Naji, right, from late 15th century Damascus. That is about the Prophet's birthday and death, right? And so sometimes you see that, and partially it's because the Prophet is believed to have died sort of, if not on his birthday, then sort of near to his birthday. So like as a sort of calendrical observation, that makes sense. But there's clearly sort of like pious commemoration of the Prophet's death as well. I just, like the only thing that I could, and this would be speculation, the only reason that I could see is, my understanding is, celebrating the Prophet's birth is very much about the Prophet's mission on this earth, right? And, for Sufis, I think that often there is a focus on being united with God, more than a focus
it's more
on
universal and a supreme occasion to celebrate and to feel, actually.
Yeah. So, I mean, perhaps the idea, because sometimes it's even called an ors, like it's like the person, like being united with God in an almost wedding-like sense.
So another question is, are there any contemporary examples of Mawlid, or is it just a classical genre of literature and music that has been practiced so far?
Oh, there are absolutely still people writing Maolids. Yeah. I have to admit, you may have gotten the sense from my presentation that I work with Arabic sources, so I can't really speak to, obviously there are many, many languages, including English, that people are writing Muslim devotional texts in. But say, when I was in Yemen, there were, living Sufi figures who have written and performed their own Maolids. There are professional chanters who have their own Maolids.
So would it be possible if you can share your reflections, your personal reflections from your previous experiences by being in this environment in Yemen and Syria? So how could you draw a picture of a Maulid celebration in the modern time?
Yeah, so I had more experience in Yemen, and honestly, it was only a few months. So I am not an expert on Yemen, but after I went there, a young journalist interviewed me for the paper and put my phone number in it, and so I got phone calls from a bunch of women who are professional Maulid chanters, inviting me to come and go observe their Maulids. And so it was really interesting that in Sana'a at that time, the vast majority of women's Maulids were after childbirth. In other words, there's this 40-day period after giving birth that the woman is sort of, she'll sort of lie in state in the best room, and they'll put, you know, sort of decorations on the wall around her. And often a woman in that situation will hold a Mawlid. And it's sort of like semi-public in the sense that, you know, kids will sort of noise around the word in the neighborhood, and, you know, lots of women will gather. And there are women, I'm sure there are ones that aren't, that are just sort of led by amateurs. But there are women who are professional Mawlid reciters, you know, who will come. And in Yemen, in the cases that I saw, there's no food involved. I mean, you get tea, but you know, it's not a banquet or any, but you know, it really is an occasion where people listen, they bless the Prophet, they, you know, they sing Tala al-Badru alayna and at the Qiyam, you know, when they stand up when the Prophet is born. They were really lovely, I have to say. But what I was mostly interested in is sort of, because these women, obviously, they're not religious scholars, right? They have different levels of education, right? So I both, you know, there are cases of women who are presenting very traditional Mawlids, sort of the same as what they had learned from, you know, an older woman who had taught them to do it. And then there are also women who were acquiring more religious education and who are very interested in, well, you know, is the information about the birth of the Prophet historically accurate? You know, like, and are really thinking about presenting material that will inform other women about the Prophet's seerah, you know, and about the Sunnah. So it was interesting to me that sort of the form was very similar, that, you know, like women were getting together to do very similar things, but the content of the Mawlid and the sort of the intention could be quite different.
So as an academic who's working and studying on the role and practices of women in Islam, so what are the things that you can share with us that you benefited from this research and book that allows you to understand better?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I really went in sort of expecting that sort of women's Mawlids would tell me something specifically about Muslim women as women, right? And, you know, like particularly in a case where a woman who had just given birth was hosting a ritual that it was about the Prophet's mother giving birth, you know, it seemed as if maybe there was a connection, right? And it was interesting to me that in that particular case, and there may be women who do Mawlids who feel completely differently about this, but I kept on asking people, you know, okay, you know, you're a new mother and this is about childbirth and about a baby and about breastfeeding and, you know, like Halima, the wet nurse and so forth, you know, like, do you identify with this? Is it significant to you that this text is about pregnancy and childbirth and breastfeeding? And they were all like, no. You know, this is about love of the Prophet, you know, and it's really not those things, about those things at all. So I don't know how much one can generalize that, but it was sort of interesting to me.
I think after some point, through the historical experience, the text has become a celebration and a spirit, and it has become an occasion for everyone, from the like wild villages to the royal palaces. So this tradition has become a shared gift for the whole community.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think we have our last question, which is the history of emotions is a new interesting area in history. do you think that the Mawlid genre can be a good source for this area?
Yes, I do. I mean, not just Maolids, but I think that, yeah, it's really hard to find sort of classical Islamic texts. Well, it's not necessarily the case, but I mean, I think it's a really good place to go if we want to know more about sort of what ordinary people, learned or unlearned, you know, sort of thought and felt about sort of what were the most important religious emotions to have, and like, how do you elicit them from yourself, right? How do you, you know, like, what is it that you have to do or think or know or think about in order to like develop the feelings that you know, that are important to you religiously? And I think Maolids are a really good example of how that happens.
So I think we've come to an end of our session. If you would like to share your last words with us, we really appreciate it.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to the hosts for inviting me, and for to anyone who's watching for your time and patience.
Thank you very much. As in most probably the most of the Mawlid texts, there are prayer chapters at the end, and I'd like to close our session with this short couplet from the famous Turkish author Süleyman Çelebi, and I'm gonna share the Turkish couplet and the English translation with you, and we will hopefully close our session. So, Ya ilahi, kılma bizi dallin, bu duaya cümlemiz deyin amin. Almighty God, from evil now deliver, amin, say all who hope in God, the giver. So, dear Professor, thank you very much for joining us today, and hoping to meet in other occasions with your further works.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.